Have you ever felt like the rules of society were just suddenly rewritten while you weren't looking? Like the social contract you signed was a forgery binding only you to its terms, while the ground beneath your feet just shifted into hostile territory.
It's a very destabilizing feeling, right? And it's exactly the nerve that today's material strikes.
Exactly. Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're joining us right now, it means you are ready to unpack some seriously heavy, unfiltered, and highly controversial material. Before we jump in, please take a second right now to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss one of these deep dives.
And we should probably tell them right off the bat.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you right off the bat, if today's breakdown hooks you, you really need to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy the book we're analyzing today. And be sure to follow the author on Substack at Conrad Riker.
Right, because this is a text that is currently generating a massive, almost seismic amount of conversation in very specific corners of the internet. And those ripples are definitely starting to hit the mainstream culture.
That's putting it mildly. Today's source material is an incredibly provocative new ebook. It's titled Gender Utopia, Turbo Tyranny of Equality of Unequal Sexes by Conrad Riker.
I like the title.
Yeah, it doesn't pull any punches. This book is essentially a raw, unapologetic manifesto. It's written directly for a men's rights activist audience and what is, widely known as the red-pilled manosphere. It operates as this survival manual for what the author characterizes as an ongoing invisible gender war.
And Riker's central thesis here is that our modern institutions, meaning academia, legacy media, corporate HR departments, and especially the family courts, have been entirely captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Right. He argues that what society currently calls equality or equity is actually a highly sophisticated trap. In his view, it's a machine of dispossession designed specifically to neuter the masculine drive and extract male resources.
Before we get into the weeds of how he constructs that argument, let's be crystal clear about our mission today. This text is politically charged. It is polarizing by design.
Highly polarizing.
Yeah. And as always, you and I aren't here to take sides. We're not here to endorse this worldview or to play referee between competing political factions. Our job today is strictly analytical.
Exactly. We are here to neutrally report on the ideas presented in the text, to take the engine of this book apart piece by piece, and to help you, the listener, really understand the historical, the psychological, and philosophical architecture of an ideology that is rapidly gaining immense traction out there.
Whether you view this book as a necessary awakening or you vehemently oppose its premise, our goal is to map this territory so you can navigate the concepts being discussed in the real world.
We're looking at the mechanics of the argument, plain and simple. So with those boundaries firmly set, let's look at the foundational premise of the book. Riker argues that Western civilization is currently witnessing the solidification of what he calls a gynocracy.
A gynocracy. He defines this as a female-centric social and legal order. But the key to his argument is that this gynocracy doesn't announce itself as a matriarchy.
Right, it doesn't put up a sign. Instead, it masquerades as fairness, diversity, and inclusion, while, according to Riker, actually operating to systematically strip men of their authority, their dignity, and their fundamental utility.
And to explain how this system allegedly took power, the text traces the history of our institutions back to a very specific philosophical turning point. And that is the widespread adoption of the blank slate fallacy.
The blank slate. So, for those who might need a quick refresher, the blank slate theory is essentially the sociological idea that human beings are born as empty vessels, right?
Yeah, it posits that all the behavioral and psychological differences between men and women are merely social constructs.
Yeah.
They're just scribbles on a chalkboard that can be erased and rewritten by progressive education, gender studies seminars, cultural conditioning.
And Riker completely rejects this. He asserts that the blank slate is not a scientific error, but a deliberate, weaponized lie designed to dismantle male competence.
He relies heavily on evolutionary biology throughout this first section to argue that men and women have profoundly different biologically hardwired roles, drives, and psychological architectures.
In his framework, men are evolutionarily optimized to be hunters, builders, risk-takers, while women are optimized as selectors and nurturers. But what's really fascinating about his approach is how he traces the ideological origin of this blank slate concept. He doesn't just blame modern sociology.
No, he draws a direct, unbroken line back to Karl Marx's 1848 Communist Manifesto.
Which is a massive historical leap. I mean, he's connecting 19th century economic theory to modern university gender studies in a way that he claims is completely transparent once you know what to look for. So, how exactly does he map that transition in the text?
It hinges on a crisis of faith within radical academia. Riker outlines how Marx originally framed the world as this eternal zero-sum struggle between two economic classes. You have the bourgeoisie, who owned factories in the capital, and the proletariat, the working class, who were endlessly exploited.
Right. And the Marxist prophecy was that the working class would inevitably rise up in a violent dialectical revolution to overthrow the owners.
Exactly. But as Riker points out, history didn't play out that way in the West. Following World War II, the Western working class didn't revolt. Instead, capitalism produced an unprecedented middle class. The workers got comfortable.
They bought washing machines, they took paid vacations, they bought homes in the suburbs.
Yeah, the economic revolution failed to materialize. So, according to the book, the radical ideologues in academia, particularly those associated with the Frankfurt School in critical theory, realized that economic class was no longer a viable wedge to divide society. They needed a new framework of oppression to keep the revolutionary engine running.
So they essentially just did a massive find and replace on the original theory.
That is exactly how he frames it. He argues they simply swapped the nouns. The bourgeoisie, the oppressor class, became men, specifically straight, white men, and the proletariat, the oppressed class, became women, and later, various minority groups.
By applying the Marxist oppressor and oppressed binary to biology instead of economics, they fundamentally rewrote the narrative of human history. Instead of viewing the historical relationship between men and women as a cooperative, symbiotic partnership necessary for species survival in a really hostile world, this new academic lens reframed all of human history as a story of endless, malicious exploitation of women by men.
And to drive home the danger of this ideological shift, he makes a really aggressive historical parallel. He compares modern, successful men in Western society to the kulak class in the Soviet Union.
The kulaks. For context, these were the relatively successful, independent peasant farmers in Russia. They were the ones who owned a little more land, maybe had a few cows, and actually knew how to farm efficiently.
Right. And Riker points out that during the Soviet collectivization, the state didn't just tax the kulaks, they demonized them as enemies of the people and ultimately liquidated them. Millions were killed or sent to the gulags.
Why? Because their individual competence and success practically disproved the state's narrative that collective farming was necessary or superior.
It's a brutal analogy, but it serves a very specific purpose in his argument. Riker argues that today, highly competent, successful men face a modern social version of this liquidation. He posits that a man's natural biological drive for dominance, hierarchy, and objective competence is a direct threat to the modern granocracy.
Just like the kulak's successful farm proved the Soviet state wrong, a man who builds, leads, and succeeds based on merit disproves the narrative of pervasive female victimization and the blank slate. Therefore, the system must pathologize his ambition, tax his resources, and socially ostracize him to maintain the illusion that the system is built on systemic oppression rather than differential competence.
The text also points to Friedrich Engels to support this idea that the destruction of the traditional family was always the endgame. He references Engels' 1884 book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State.
Yes, and he treats that specific text as the absolute blueprint for modern institutional feminism. Engels explicitly argued that the monogamous nuclear family was essentially a capitalist construct, an invention designed to control inheritance and enslave women within the domestic sphere.
Riker uses Engels to argue that the modern institutions currently flying the flag of equal rights are operating under false pretenses. The ultimate goal, he asserts, isn't equal opportunity in the workplace. It's the absolute abolition of the nuclear family unit itself, because the family is the primary barrier to total state dependence.
He argues that modern ideology uses the term equity as a Trojan horse. Equity, by definition, demands equal outcomes, not equal opportunities. And to achieve equal outcomes between two fundamentally different biological groups, you have to tear down the hierarchy of competence. You have to actively penalize the group that naturally excels in certain high-variance fields.
Which brings up a terrifying hypothetical that the book leans into. If you have a society that fundamentally ignores objective reality and legislates against biological differences, what actually happens to the physical infrastructure of that society?
Riker addresses this by contrasting sociological theory with hard science. He brings up the SRY gene. This is the sex-determining region on the Y chromosome. It is the genetic trigger that initiates male sex determination, flooding the fetus with testosterone and fundamentally altering brain development, muscle density, bone structure.
Right, and Riker uses the SRY gene metaphorically to represent the fact that biology is a dictatorship of physics and genetics. You cannot vote it away. You cannot deconstruct it in a sociology paper.
And to bolster his argument that the institutions ignoring this are built on a foundation of sand, he points directly to the 2015 reproducibility crisis in psychology. This is a fascinating pivot in the text. He's taking the ultimate hard science genetics and using it as a battering ram against the social sciences.
The 2015 reproducibility crisis was a massive shockwave. This was when a huge team of researchers, the Open Science Collaboration, attempted to replicate 100 published peer-reviewed psychology studies and found they could only successfully replicate about 39 of them.
Over 60% of the foundational studies they tested completely failed to produce the same results.
It was an absolute earthquake in academia, and Riker leverages it relentlessly. He highlights that the fields of sociology, psychology, and particularly gender studies were among the worst offenders in this crisis. They were relying on packing, publication bias, and incredibly small sample sizes to generate headlines.
Riker argues that Western society is currently restructuring its entire legal framework, corporate hiring practices, and social norms based on science that is statistically less reliable than a coin flip.
He uses the gender wage gap narrative as a prime example here, which is treated as proof of systemic discrimination.
But Riker argues that when economists control for the actual variables like hours worked, willingness to commute, danger of the job, and specific career choices, the gap virtually disappears. Yet the institutions continue to push the raw, debunked statistic.
He calls this policy-based evidence. The political conclusion is predetermined by the gynocracy, and the academic research is retroactively manufactured to support it.
And his ultimate conclusion for this section is incredibly bleak. If you build a civilization on policies that actively deny fundamental biological imperatives and mathematical reality, you are essentially legislating against gravity. It might hold up for a generation or two through sheer momentum and printed money, but eventually the structural integrity of a society will collapse.
Precisely. But the book doesn't just stay in the ivory tower of historical theory and academic critique. Riker takes this premise and applies it directly to the lived experience of the modern male. He argues that this ideological war is not just happening in academic journals, it is being waged directly on male psychology, minute by minute, day by day.
Which brings us to the core psychological mechanism of the book, what he terms the toxic masculinity double bind. This is arguably the concept that the rest of his practical advice hinges on. He describes it as a sophisticated psychological snare, a catch-22 designed to induce a state of permanent anxiety and paralysis in men.
The trap works like this. Society actively shames men for their natural biological drives. Things like dominance, physical aggression, extreme competitiveness, and stoicism are relabeled under the umbrella term of toxic masculinity. Men are told to open up, to be vulnerable, to cry, to act more like women.
But the bind, the trapdoor in this social contract, is what happens when a man actually follows that advice. Riker argues that the moment a man displays true weakness, vulnerability, or emotional instability, he is instantly penalized by the very people who demanded he open up.
He is stripped of respect in the workplace, his authority in his household evaporates, and most crucially, he experiences a catastrophic loss of sexual attraction from his partner. Riker points to the biological reality of female hypergamy, which we'll definitely get into later, to argue that women are biologically hardwired to be repulsed by male weakness, regardless of what modern feminist theory tells them they should want.
So the man is caught in a vice. He is a toxic monster if he acts like a traditional man, but he is a pathetic loser who deserves to be abandoned if he acts like a modern, vulnerable man. There is no winning move within the system.
And to enforce this double bind, the text outlines how modern institutions use incredibly manipulative linguistic techniques. He spends a lot of time on a concept called Kafka trapping.
Kafka trapping. This is named after the author Franz Kafka, who wrote these nightmarish, surreal stories where the protagonist is accused of a vague crime and the system is entirely rigged against them. In a Kafka trap, the very act of denying a crime is used by the accuser as absolute proof of your guilt.
It's a closed-loop logical fallacy, and Riker argues it is the primary weapon of HR departments and social justice activists. He provides a hypothetical scenario to illustrate this. Imagine a man is accused of having unconscious bias or being inherently sexist simply by virtue of being a white male in a corporate environment.
If the man attempts to defend himself, Perhaps by pointing to his track record of mentoring female colleagues or his egalitarian voting record, the ideologue will simply smile and say, "Your defensiveness and refusal to acknowledge your privilege is exactly what a sexist with unconscious bias would say. Your denial proves your guilt."
It makes it impossible to mount a defense. You're guilty if you confess, and you are doubly guilty if you deny it.
He also looks at how everyday language has been weaponized through what he calls Pavlovian conditioning. He points to the popularization of terms like mansplaining or manspreading. He argues that these aren't just internet buzzwords, they are calculated psychological tools used to pathologize the basic physical and verbal existence of men.
By attaching the prefix man to a negative behavior, society trains people to implicitly associate masculinity with annoyance, arrogance, and intrusion. He suggests that the concept of male privilege functions in the modern era exactly like the religious concept of original sin.
You are born inherently guilty. Simply for drawing breath with a Y chromosome, you owe a permanent, unpayable debt of reparations for historical crimes you never personally committed, to people who were never actually victims of those crimes.
To ground this theoretical psychological warfare in stark reality, Riker points to how early this conditioning begins. He dedicates a substantial portion of the text to what he calls the war on boys within the public education system. He doesn't just use statistics. He uses highly evocative anecdotes to paint a picture of an environment that is deeply hostile to male nature.
The story he uses that really sticks out is the case of Josh Welch. It sounds almost like dark satire, but it actually happened. Josh was a 7-year-old boy in a Maryland elementary school. He was suspended for 2 days. His crime: he was eating a strawberry pastry, a Pop-Tart, and he'd shoot it into a shape that a teacher decided vaguely resembled a gun.
He didn't threaten anyone. He didn't have a weapon. He was a 7-year-old playing with his food.
Right. And Riker uses this absurd draconian punishment to argue that public education has become a hostile environment that acts as a chemical and disciplinary straitjacket. The system literally criminalizes the innate biological male propensity for rough and tumble play, weaponizing normal boyhood curiosity.
And he backs that specific micro-level anecdote up with a terrifying macro-level statistic. Riker cites the data showing a 400% skyrocketing of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder diagnoses in boys since the early 1990s.
400%.
Yes. He challenges the reader to apply basic logic to this data. He asks, did male biology suddenly, spontaneously mutate on a genetic level in a single generation to become defective? Or has the educational environment become so rigidly pathologically incompatible with the nature of boys that normal behavior is now classified as a disease?
He frames this dynamic as a literal chemical war on kinetic energy. The modern classroom is designed around a compliant, sedentary, highly feminized learning style: sitting still, reading quietly, expressing emotions.
When a young boy with high testosterone and a biological need for physical movement inevitably fails to conform to that environment, the system doesn't adjust the environment, it medicates the boy. It chemically lobotomizes the hunter out of him so he can sit still in a chair for 8 hours.
He takes this critique of the psychological establishment straight to the top. The text references the American Psychological Association's 2018 publication, which were the guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men. This was a highly controversial document, and Riker treats it as the ultimate smoking gun.
He claims this official guideline from the premier psychological institution in the world effectively labels traditional masculinity ideology, things like stoicism, competitiveness, and the desire to provide and protect, as psychologically harmful. He argues the APA has essentially pathologized the male psyche as a disorder awaiting to happen.
This is where Riker connects the psychological conditioning back to human biology, and it's perhaps one of the most compelling biological arguments in the book. He references the work of John Coates, a neuroscientist and former Wall Street trader who researched something called the winner effect.
Coates' work in endocrinology shows that when a male wins a physical or social confrontation, his brain floods with testosterone and dopamine. This hormonal surge literally changes his brain structure, improving his confidence, increasing his risk tolerance, and enhancing his capacity to win again in the future. It's an upward spiral of competence and dominance.
But the reverse is also true, right?
Exactly, and that is Riker's core point. A man's testosterone production is exquisitely, highly sensitive to his perceived social status and peer acceptance. When society, through the media, the schools, and the HR departments, constantly bombards men with the messaging that their very existence is an act of oppression, that their instincts are toxic, the primal part of the male brain interprets this as a catastrophic, ongoing loss of social status.
It signals to the body that the man is at the bottom of the tribal hierarchy.
Right. This state of constant status anxiety and social rejection triggers a flood of cortisol, the stress hormone, which actively suppresses testosterone production. Riker argues this isn't just hurting men's feelings, it is the systemic induction of guilt acting as a biological weapon. He calls it the chemical castration of the male population through psychological warfare.
That is an incredibly heavy assertion. The idea that cultural messaging is physically altering the hormonal makeup of a generation of men. So if the mind and the biology are under constant systemic attack, the book naturally pivots to the physical and financial reality. If you are chemically suppressed and psychologically trapped, what is happening to your wallet, your labor, and your physical safety?
Which brings us to section 3 of Riker's analysis, where he critiques the modern workplace, which he calls corporate castration, and the family court system, which he brutally terms the marriage plantation.
Riker's economic and legal analysis in this section is built entirely on the premise that the state has effectively nationalized the traditional male role. Historically, in the context of the nuclear family, the husband was the sole provider and the physical protector.
In exchange for that immense burden, he was granted authority, respect, and a guaranteed lineage. But now, Riker argues, the massive expansion of the welfare state and the extreme bias of the no-fault divorce courts have allowed the government to step in and replace the husband.
The state provides the financial safety net, and the police provide the protection. But the state has the added tyrannical advantage of using the legal system to confiscate the man's wealth through disproportionate taxation, alimony, and child support to fund its own programs and subsidize the woman who initiated the divorce. He calls this dynamic the utility paradox.
I really want to dig into the mechanics of this utility paradox. It feels like he's describing a trap where men are treated as completely essential to the functioning of society, yet simultaneously despised by it. How does he map out the specifics of that paradox?
The utility paradox is the grim reality that men are expected to be the structural cinder blocks holding up the entire sprawling house of civilization. They provide the vast majority of the hard labor, they pay the lion's share of net taxes, they build the infrastructure, and they staff the military and emergency services to provide physical protection.
Society demands this utility, but in return, under the rules of the gynocracy, they receive absolutely no authority, no respect, and no gratitude. They are placed on what he calls the hamster wheel.
And the wheel only spins in one direction.
Correct. If a man realizes the deal is bad and decides to stop running, if he drops out of the corporate grind, minimizes his income, and refuses to marry, he is instantly labeled by the culture as a deadbeat, a loser, or a Peter Pan who refuses to grow up. Society attempts to shame him back into utility.
But if he keeps running on the wheel, working 60 hours a week to generate resources that are immediately confiscated by family courts or redistributed by a gynocentric state apparatus, he is merely functioning as a disposable tool for a matriarchy that hates him. He is caught in a vice between total servitude and total ostracization.
To illustrate the profound hypocrisy of how society views male utility, he points out a massive, glaring blind spot in the mainstream cultural conversation regarding workplace equality. We are constantly inundated with articles and initiatives about the glass ceiling, the idea that there is an invisible barrier preventing women from reaching the absolute highest echelons of corporate power, the CEO roles, and the corner offices.
But Riker introduces a concept originally coined by the author Warren Farrell, the glass cellar.
The glass cellar is where the true burden of civilization is carried. Riker shares staggering, undeniable data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics from 2022 to make this point. In that single year, men accounted for 93% of all fatal work injuries. We are talking about 4,896 men who died violent, crushing, toxic deaths at work, compared to 377 women.
Almost 5,000 men dying just to keep the lights on and the water running.
Yes. And Riker uses this horrific statistic to expose what he views as the absolute moral bankruptcy of modern equality narratives. He argues that society, and specifically modern feminism, fully expects and demands that men continue to occupy the glass cellar. They demand men go down into the sewers, work the DC oil rigs, climb the high-voltage power lines in ice storms, and die in trench collapses on construction sites.
But the culture aggressively refuses to grant men the societal standing, respect, or even basic acknowledgement that should accompany that blood sacrifice. He challenges the listener with a thought experiment. If feminist institutions truly wanted absolute equality, they wouldn't just be demanding 50-50 representation in the climate-controlled boardrooms of Fortune 500 companies.
They would be marching in the streets, demanding 50-50 representation in commercial logging fatalities, sewage maintenance, and deep coal mining. The silence on the glass cellar, he argues, proves that the movement is about power and resource extraction, not equality.
The book also takes this concept of male disposability and applies it to the legal system, specifically examining domestic violence laws to show how male biology itself is essentially criminalized by the state. He tells a very detailed hypothetical story based on thousands of real-world cases. He introduces us to Tom.
Tom, the construction worker.
Right. Tom is a large, capable, physically strong guy. One night, he comes home, and his wife, who is heavily intoxicated and in a rage, attacks him with a kitchen knife. Tom, because he is strong and capable, easily disarms her. He doesn't strike her, he doesn't hurt her, he simply restrains her wrist to protect himself and waits for the police to arrive.
But when the cops finally show up and walk through the door, they immediately put Tom in handcuffs and take him to jail. Why? Riker explains it is because of something called the Duluth model.
The Duluth model is absolutely central to Riker's scathing critique of the legal system. For context, the Duluth model is a domestic violence intervention framework that was heavily institutionalized across the United States by the 1994 Violence Against Women Act, or VLOA.
The underlying sociological philosophy of the Duluth model is that domestic violence is not caused by individual psychological issues, substance abuse, or relationship dynamics. Instead, it posits that domestic violence is exclusively a tool of patriarchal control used by men to oppress women.
Therefore, the framework dictates that police must essentially treat the man as the primary aggressor in almost every domestic dispute, regardless of the immediate forensic context or who called 911.
It operates on a sociological assumption rather than evidence.
Precisely. Riker points out that under the policies influenced by this model, police officers are routinely trained to arrest the larger, stronger party, or the party that poses the most threat, which, due to basic sexual dimorphism, is almost always the man.
So, in our story, Tom goes to jail, loses his job, and gets a restraining order slapped on him simply because he is bigger and stronger, even though he was the victim of an armed assault. Riker uses this to argue that in the eyes of the modern gynocracy, male physical strength and the instinct for self-preservation are legally treated as crimes.
The system actively erases male victims from the legal record, denies them basic due process, and uses the power of the state to enforce female domestic dominance. It paints a terrifying picture of the male citizen as entirely disposable, a beast of burden with no inherent human rights.
And to hammer home just how vital this disposable class actually is, Riker proposes a massive, hypothetical thought experiment for the reader to consider. A total global day without men strike.
If we extrapolate his argument to its logical apocalyptic conclusion, he points out the hypocrisy of modern protests. We've seen highly publicized Day Without Women protests over the last decade, which Riker somewhat dismissively characterizes as mostly performative disruptions in media, HR, and middle management. Inconvenient, but not existential.
But he asks the reader to seriously visualize what would actually happen if the disposable males, the men in the glass cellar, simply stopped working everywhere, all at once, for just 24 hours.
The timeline he lays out is chilling. Within the first few hours, the global power grid would begin to fail as maintenance crews stayed home. Water treatment plants were shut down, leading to immediate sanitation crises in major cities.
Police, fire, and emergency medical services would essentially vanish. By the end of the day, grocery store shelves would be empty because the long-haul trucking network and the dock workers wouldn't roll. Society would descend into absolute primal chaos before the sun came up the next day.
He uses this apocalyptic vision to hammer home what he calls the sinner argument. The premise is that the very traits society screams about and labels as toxic masculinity, the aggression, the stoicism, the physical density, the capacity for violence, are actually the load-bearing pillars of civilization. They are the crushing weight holding the sky up.
And that leads to a profound sense of alienation. So this systemic devaluation is happening in the educational system, it's codified in the family courts, and it's lethal in the workplace. But Riker argues that dispossession permeates even deeper than the law or the economy. It infects the most intimate, fundamental aspects of human life, modern dating and pair bonding.
This is where the book shifts into some of its most controversial territory. This leads us to Section 4, his incredibly cold, almost mathematically detached view of what he calls the sexual marketplace meritocracy. He outright rejects the feminist claim that we live in a patriarchy. He says if you look at the reality of the dating world, we actually live in a feudal dictatorship defined entirely by what he terms gynocentric gravity.
It's a brutal, highly transactional economic analogy. Riker builds this section around the biological concept of female hypergamy. Hypergamy is the evolutionary drive for females to mate upward or across in hierarchies of status, competence, wealth, and physical protection. He argues this is a natural instinct, evolved to ensure the survival of offspring in a dangerous world.
Historically, however, this drive was kept in check by friction. Geography, small social circles, religious norms, and the sheer necessity of a dual income household for survival meant that most women had to choose from the men immediately available in their village or town. This allowed the vast majority of average men to find a partner, marry, and invest in the social order.
But Riker argues that modern technology, specifically the advent of dating apps and social media, has completely obliterated that friction and weaponized the hypergamous drive.
Exactly. Dating apps create an illusion of infinite global choice. A woman is no longer comparing the men in her local town. She is comparing them against the top 1% of men globally who are heavily curated on Instagram and Tinder.
And the data he pulls into the text to support this shift is pretty mind-bending. He isn't just theorizing, he's citing internal metrics from the tech companies themselves. He cites a famous 2014 Quartz analysis of Tinder's internal algorithms and user behavior, which showed that the bottom 80% of men on the app are effectively invisible to the opposite sex.
They receive virtually zero engagement. The data showed that women on the app compete fiercely and exclusively for the top tier of males, the wealthiest, tallest, most attractive 20%, leaving the vast majority of average men swiping into an absolute void, experiencing constant algorithmic rejection.
He pairs that with an even more revealing piece of data from a 2010 OkCupid internal blog post. The data scientists at OkCupid looked at how men and women rated each other's attractiveness. Men, generally following a normal distribution curve, rated women relatively evenly. Some were very attractive, some were not, most were average.
But the data found something mathematically impossible on the female side. Women rated a staggering 80% of all men as below average in attractiveness.
Which, as he points out, is a statistical impossibility.
Right. In any normal distribution curve of a population, only 50% can mathematically be below the median average. Riker argues that when a collective group of women looks at a massive sample size of men and claims that 4 out of 5 of them are subpar or ugly, they are revealing a profoundly warped psychological perception.
The baseline expectation has shifted so radically that the top 20% of men are now considered the average, and everyone else is subhuman. This digital marketplace entirely breaks traditional monogamous pair bonding. It creates a harem economy where the top men have infinite access to casual sex. The majority of women share those top men without securing commitment, and the bottom 80% of men are entirely locked out of the reproductive cycle.
And this is where Riker introduces his incredibly provocative dichotomy of the simp versus the pimp, strictly in a macroeconomic sense.
Yes, it's vital to understand he is using these terms as economic archetypes, not necessarily literal street definitions. He defines the simp as the great modern tragedy. The simp is the average man who still believes in the old social contract that the gynocracy is already torn up. Economically speaking, the simp is a man who agrees to subsidize a woman's bad decisions. He buys high into a crashed market.
Riker paints the picture of a man who works hard, saves his money, and in his 30s marries a woman who spent her 20s on the dating carousel, chasing the top 20% of men on dating apps, accumulating a high partner count, racking up consumer debt, and failing to secure a commitment from those high-status men.
Now that her biological clock is ticking and her market value is depreciating, she settles for the simp. She demands his financial resources, his utility, and his stability, but she fundamentally does not respect him, often withholding intimacy. The simp accepts this terrible deal because he is desperate for validation.
Conversely, Riker uses the term pimp metaphorically to describe a man who has unplugged from the matrix and enforces what he calls market discipline.
The pimp, in Riker's framework, is simply a man who understands objective market value and evolutionary biology. He operates with cold rationality. He absolutely refuses to buy high. He refuses to commit his hard-earned resources, his legal liability, or his emotional bandwidth to a depreciated asset, meaning a partner who did not value commitment, traditional roles, or his specific utility when she had the leverage of her youth and fertility to offer.
Riker anticipates the backlash here and argues aggressively that this mindset isn't misogyny, it's basic, rational economic literacy. He states that the entire gynocratic system, the whole bloated apparatus, relies entirely on the bottom 80% of men being simps.
The system requires them to ignore their own rational self-interest, to ignore the terrible legal risks of the marriage plantation, and to willingly prop up a failing social order with their taxes and labor. Riker posits that when men wake up and adopt the mindset of enforcing market discipline, when they collectively fold their hands and withdraw their resources, they force a societal correction. They force a return to traditional pair bonding values through sheer unyielding market pressure.
Okay, so we've covered the book's massive, overarching diagnosis of the problem. Riker believes the system is rigged against men on every conceivable front. In the classroom with ADHD medication, in the courtroom with the Duluth model, in the boardroom with the glass cellar, and in the bedroom with the digital hypergamy of the dating apps. So the ultimate question is, what does the author suggest men actually do about it?
This brings us to Section 5, the final part of the book, which outlines his action plan. Reclaiming sovereignty and building what he calls the patriarchal renaissance. The ultimate goal here isn't to reform the system. He believes it's too far gone for that. The goal is to execute a strategic, permanent exit from the utility matrix. Stop being a hero for a society that actively despises you.
This action plan is incredibly detailed, synthesizing both profound philosophical reprogramming and highly practical, borderline militant operational steps. Philosophically, Riker demands that men immediately adopt what he calls the Stoic fork.
This is derived from ancient Stoic philosophy, specifically Epictetus. You must sharply, ruthlessly differentiate between what you have absolute control over and what you cannot control. You cannot control the bias of family court judges. You cannot control the feminist narratives pushed by the legacy media. You cannot control the algorithms of Tinder.
Wasting emotional energy on these things is a trap. You can only control your own skills, your financial assets, your physical conditioning, your emotional reactivity, and your alliances. He pairs this Stoic discipline with the concept of amor veritatis, the love of truth over the love of fate or comfort.
And a massive part of practicing amor veritatis in the modern world is avoiding what he terms the apology trap. We see this play out in the media almost every day. He points out that when a public figure, usually a man, is targeted by a cancel culture mob for perceived transgression, maybe an off-color joke, or stating a biological fact, the PR instinct is to issue a groveling public apology to appease the mob.
But Riker notes that the apology never works. It inevitably destroys the man. The apology acts as blood in the water for sharks. It signals submission. On a biological level, it drops your testosterone, and on a social level, it tells the mob that you are prey and that their tactics work.
Riker's rule for the sovereign man is absolute and uncompromising. Never, under any circumstances, apologize for being a man, for displaying masculine traits, or for speaking objective truth. Let them cancel you, but never bow.
Building from that hardened philosophical base, he moves to the absolute necessity of building the sanctuary of brotherhood. Riker argues that an isolated, atomized man is incredibly weak. He is easily picked off by HR departments, family courts, and social ostracization. But a cohesive, loyal band of brothers is an unstoppable political and economic force.
To illustrate why the state fears male bonding, he looks deep into history, specifically to the Roman Senate's violent suppression of the Bacchanalia in 186 BC.
I found this historical tangent fascinating. Why did the Roman Senate care about a cult festival?
The mainstream history often paints the Bacchanalia as just a series of wild, immoral parties. But Riker argues the Roman Senate didn't care about the drinking or the debauchery. They brought the hammer down, executing thousands of people, because the cult involved secret, unsanctioned societies of men swearing oaths of loyalty to each other that superseded their loyalty to the state.
The Senate recognized that an organized brotherhood of men operating outside the official hierarchy was a direct existential threat to the Republic's monopoly on power.
And Riker argues the modern corporate state fears male bonding for the exact same reason. When men gather in exclusive spaces, without what he calls the female approval filter modifying their speech and behavior, they organize. They speak freely, they share resources, and they build leverage. That's why he claims there is a relentless, coordinated institutional push for entryism.
Entryism is the tactic of forcing women into every historically male-only space under the unassailable guise of inclusivity and diversity. We've seen it with the Boy Scouts, the Freemasons, elite military units, and corporate boardrooms.
Riker argues this has nothing to do with women wanting to tie knots in the woods. It is a deliberate tactic by the gynocracy to dismantle the sanctuary of brotherhood. By introducing the female dynamic, the men inevitably begin competing for female approval. The raw, unfiltered truth is suppressed to avoid offense, and the potency of the male coalition is permanently diluted.
Riker insists that sovereign men must forcefully reject entryism. They must form exclusive brotherhoods that act as a mishi, borrowing the term for the fiercely loyal political enforcers and inner circle of Roman consuls. These aren't just drinking buddies who watch football together. These are mutual aid societies designed to legally, financially, and socially protect each other from hostile HR departments, cancel culture mobs, and legal overreach. They must operate as a unified political entity.
The practical logistical strategies he outlines to achieve this independence fall under the umbrella of what is often called the Dark Enlightenment. It's a survival guide for completely exiting the mainstream economy. First on the list is building parallel economies.
He points directly to the Canadian Freedom Convoy trucker protests in 2022 as a watershed moment in the gender war. During that protest, when working class men demanded bodily autonomy and defied the state, the Canadian government didn't just arrest them, they invoked emergency powers to literally freeze their personal bank accounts, cutting them off from their own money to crush the dissent.
Riker uses that terrifying event to argue that the traditional centralized banking system is no longer a neutral service. It is an active enforcement tool for the state and the gynocracy. If your money is in a traditional bank, you are entirely vulnerable to being unbanked for your political views or having your assets stripped in a biased family court.
His solution is absolute financial independence through technology. He advocates heavily for cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin, and decentralized finance, or DeFi. He argues that sovereign men must move their wealth into encrypted, decentralized ledgers where no judge, no ex-wife, and no government bureaucrat can freeze or confiscate their life's work.
He also advocates for what he calls geographic arbitrage. This is a massive life change. He argues that the Western system, the US, Canada, the UK, is locked into a mathematical certainty of demographic collapse, hyperinflation, and escalating hostility toward men.
His advice: vote with your feet, take your decentralized money, take your remote work skills, and permanently relocate to low-cost, high-freedom jurisdictions. He frequently points to Eastern Europe, South America, or Southeast Asia, places where the cultural rot hasn't set in, where the cost of living is a fraction of the West, and where, in his words, men are still allowed to be men and women still value traditional families.
And finally, to protect the mind from being dragged back into the matrix, he demands a strict masculine media diet. He classifies the legacy mainstream media, Hollywood, and the majority of social media algorithms as the propaganda arm of the gynocracy.
He describes it as tofu for the mind synthetic, estrogenic, and designed to make you weak, fearful, and compliant. You cannot sustain the mindset of a sovereign builder on a diet of BuzzFeed articles, daytime television, and outreach bait news. He instructs his readers to cut the cord entirely, starve the beast.
Replace that content with the study of Stoic philosophy, evolutionary biology, military history, and unfiltered independent analysis from creators who operate outside the system.
Which brings us to a profound and necessary point of speculation. Listening to this entire action plan, Riker is advocating for a massive, coordinated withdrawal of male utility from mainstream society. He is telling men to check out financially, romantically, geographically, and institutionally. He wants the most competent men to build sovereign, parallel structures completely outside the view of the state. They have to stop and ask, what is the ultimate endgame of this total societal bifurcation?
It is the most critical question the book raises. If Riker's vision comes to pass, and the top tier of competent, driven, productive men systematically exit the traditional economy, refuse to marry, refuse to pay into the tax base, and take their capital offshore, how does the existing society function?
Does the gynocracy adapt, perhaps relying entirely on automation, AI, and ever-expanding police state? Or does the entire bloated apparatus simply collapse in on itself under the weight of its own immense administrative overhead, unable to stand once the cinder blocks are removed?
It is an incredible... And taking a deep breath here, we have covered a massive, sprawling amount of highly charged, controversial material from Conrad Riker's Gender Utopia. We certainly have. And as we wrap up this analysis, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative reflection to mull over as you go about your day. Whether you view Conrad Riker's book as a vital, necessary awakening and a survival guide for the modern man, or whether you view it as a paranoid, dangerous radicalization, the text points to an undeniable, gaping rupture in the social contract of Western civilization.
I want you to think about this. What actually happens to a civilization when its builders, its innovators, the men who climb the poles in the ice storms, and its protectors decide that the cost of participation is simply too high, The disrespect is too profound, and they collectively, quietly decide to just let the roof cave in.
It's a question that goes far, far beyond the daily trivial squabbles of internet gender politics. It strikes directly at the vulnerable heart of human survival and societal continuity. Once you see the infrastructure of the world through that lens, you can't unsee the fragile nature of everything around us.
Thank you all for joining us on this incredibly intense deep dive. If this breakdown fascinated you, if you want to explore these arguments, check the data, and read the manifesto for yourself, head over to Amazon Kindle or Google Playbooks right now to buy Gender Utopia, Turbo Tyranny of Equality of Unequal Sexes. And be sure to follow the author on Substack at Conrad Riker for more of his unfiltered, raw analysis. Finally, please do not forget to like and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these deep dives into the books shaping our culture. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning the rules of the game.